happened during this waiting season. And God allowed that space not to distance you from one another, but to give both of you the distance necessary for clarity. The preparation wasn't only on their side, it was on yours. There are versions of you that existed months or years ago that simply weren't ready for the kind of relationship you've been praying for. Maybe you were carrying too much fear. Maybe your boundaries weren't strong enough. Maybe you were too eager to give everything without making sure the other person was prepared to receive it. You've grown, you suffered, learned, questioned, healed, and matured. And the strength you gained wasn't accidental, it was purposeful. God was forming you into someone who can stand in a relationship without losing yourself. Someone who can offer love without collapsing under the weight of expectation. This person needed that same process. They needed to confront their avoidance, their fear of vulnerability, their difficulty with emotional honesty. They needed to learn what commitment actually requires. They needed to lose the illusion that they had unlimited time. Sometimes people don't grow until they're confronted with the possibility of losing something significant. And God uses that realization to break open the heart in ways nothing else can. When God says the wait is almost over, it means the season of wandering has achieved its purpose. It means the lessons have taken root. It means both hearts are becoming aligned at the same time in the same direction. It means the preparation phase is ending and the unfolding is beginning. So the delay wasn't punishment. It was protection. It was alignment. It was transformation happening in ways you couldn't see, but will soon understand. And now, as this chapter turns, remember this. The wait wasn't wasted. Every moment was building you into someone capable of receiving what's finally coming towards you. There's a moment in every meaningful connection when time itself becomes a teacher. Not a punisher, not an obstacle, but a guide. And what most people misunderstand is that waiting isn't passive. It's actually one of the most active psychological processes a person can go through. When you're waiting for someone you believe God has aligned you with, you're not just sitting in stillness, you're being shaped. And often the message that emerges from that shaping is subtle but unmistakable. The wait is almost over because the lesson is nearly learned. When God is preparing two people for each other, He works on them separately before He brings them together. That's not punishment. That's wisdom. Because if you bring two unprepared people into a meaningful relationship, the relationship collapses under the weight of their unresolved chaos. And deep down, you know that. You know that if this connection had come earlier, before the clarity, before the emotional discipline, before the self-awareness, you might have sabotaged it, or they might have. There's a maturity that only time can carve into the human psyche. So when God whispers that the wait is almost over, it usually means something very specific. You've reached a threshold, a psychological and spiritual threshold, where your internal landscape has changed enough that you no longer relate to love the way you once did. Maybe you're not chasing validation anymore. Maybe you're not confusing intensity for intimacy. Maybe you've stopped projecting fantasies onto people and have started seeing them as they really are. Or maybe for the first time you're choosing from strength rather than desperation. That shift alters everything, and it alters them too. People imagine that God prepares them individually, but they forget He's preparing the other person simultaneously. And sometimes that's the delay. Not your readiness, not your willingness, but theirs. And if you force something before it's time, you're not accelerating destiny. You're disrupting it. That's why divine timing is so critical. It's not just about the moment you come together. It's about the version of yourselves that greet each other. Often the sign that the wait is ending is the internal peace that begins to settle over you. You stop fighting reality. You stop demanding answers. You stop obsessing over timelines. And that acceptance isn't resignation, it's clarity. It's the kind of clarity that comes when your soul finally aligns with what it knows to be true. What is meant for you doesn't need to be chased, manipulated, or forced. It arrives when both people are capable of sustaining it. And here's something most people overlook. When a promise is near fulfillment anxiety tends to spike. Not because something is wrong, but because your psyche senses change before your circumstances reveal it. You start feeling the shift before you see the evidence. That internal tension is like the last mile of a long journey. The moment when your body is tired, your mind is stretched, but your spirit knows you're close. That's why God often speaks reassurance at this stage. That's why he says, hold on, you're almost there. So if you're feeling that mixture of anticipation and exhaustion, understand that it's not a sign of delay. It's a sign of proximity. You're not losing ground. You're reaching the end of the preparation phase. And the moment both hearts align with the lesson, the union becomes inevitable because destiny doesn't need convincing. It needs readiness. And maybe that's what God is telling you right now. You're ready, and so are they. The waiting season is giving way to the becoming season. And the becoming season always ends with divine convergence. Let that truth settle in your mind and reshape the way you show up in the present moment. The wait is almost over. Act like someone who's prepared to step into what you've been praying for. There comes a point in any spiritually significant connection when the emotional intensity becomes impossible to ignore. It's not merely longing and it's not fantasy. It's a persistent internal awareness that something is shifting for you, for them, and for the space between you. And the interesting part is that this awareness doesn't come from overthinking or forcing outcomes. It arises almost organically. The way dawn breaks after a long night, gradually at first, then unmistakably. That's why so many people describe this season as feeling the change before they see it. The psyche often knows long before the physical world rearranges itself. And this shouldn't surprise us. Human beings are wired to detect patterns, especially emotional and relational ones. When something that once felt distant suddenly feels near, that's not imagination. It's sensitivity. It's the ability to register subtle shifts in your internal landscape. When God is bringing two people closer, he doesn't always announce it with dramatic signs. More often, he adjusts the emotional frequency. You notice you're calmer, you're clearer, you're less reactive to what would have upset you before, or maybe you've stopped doubting yourself in the same way. That inner steadiness is not accidental. It's preparation for connection. At the same time, there's usually a parallel shift in your perspective on the other person. You stop romanticizing who you think they are, and you begin to see them more realistically with their strengths, their wounds, their contradictions, their humanity. And instead of discouraging you, the clarity grounds you. You realize that loving someone or being loved by someone requires truth, not illusion. It demands responsibility, not projection. And you can feel yourself gravitating toward that responsibility in a way you weren't capable of before. That's part of the spiritual alignment. Two people cannot meet meaningfully if they're each holding on to versions of themselves that are incompatible with genuine commitment. So God works in the quiet spaces, the late night reflections, the uncomfortable realizations, the moments of emotional friction, not to punish you, but to refine you, to bring out the part of you that can sustain the connection he intends to give you. When you start noticing yourself becoming more patient, more discerning, more emotionally stable, that's not just personal growth, it's relational readiness. And it goes both ways because while you're undergoing that shift, they are too. This is what many people underestimate. They assume they're alone in the transformation. But connections that are spiritually aligned tend to evolve in parallel, even from a distance, even without communication. The psychological development of one often triggers the development of the other. It's as though the soul senses when another soul is approaching readiness. That's why reconnections, reunions, and new beginnings often happen suddenly because the groundwork was being laid silently for months, even years. So when you feel the intensity increasing, not in a chaotic way, but in a grounded, centered, mature way, it's because the distance between you and the person God aligned you with is shrinking. Not physically, but spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. You're meeting at the level of readiness long before your lives intersect again. And that's why the wait starts feeling different. Not heavy anymore, not confusing, but purposeful. It becomes clear that something is aligning beyond your control. But here's the crucial part. You must remain aware enough to respond to this shift, not resist it. Because when the moment of convergence arrives, the person you've become is the person you'll bring into that connection. And if you've ignored the internal transformation, you risk repeating old patterns. But if you honor it, everything changes. So pay attention to your growth. Pay attention to the stability settling into your spirit. Pay attention to that pull toward truth, humility, and responsibility. Because when your inner world aligns with your destiny, your outer world eventually follows. And that's the moment everything turns in your favor. One of the most overlooked indicators that the wait is nearly over isn't external at all. It's the quiet but undeniable shift in the way you interpret the meaning of your past experiences, especially the painful ones. At some point, you stop viewing what happened between you and this person as random or unfair. And you start seeing it as necessary, not ideal, not pleasant, but necessary. And that shift is profound because it marks the moment when your mind stops resisting the story and begins integrating it. You can't move forward with someone while still resenting the path that led to them. This is where people often underestimate the psychological complexity of reunion or reconnection. They think God is simply waiting for time to pass so circumstances can line up. But usually the deeper work is internal, clearing resentment, dissolving illusions, accepting accountability. You reach a stage where you can acknowledge without bitterness that both of you made mistakes. Both of you had immaturities. Both of you were learning how to handle emotions you'd never experienced before. And instead of blaming or shaming, you begin to understand that understanding is the doorway to emotional maturity. And emotional maturity is what prepares you for the connection you've been waiting for. You start recognizing that pain is not the opposite of progress. It is often the catalyst for it. Growth rarely comes without friction. Lives don't align without disruption. And two people destined to support one another on a deeper level usually must confront the parts of themselves that would destroy the connection if left unchecked. That's why God allows separation, not as punishment, but as training, not to break you, but to shape you. It's the same reason you can look back now and see that certain conversations, certain endings, certain misunderstandings had to happen exactly the way they did. You wouldn't have learned self-respect without the distance. You wouldn't have discovered your boundaries without the conflict. You wouldn't have developed emotional clarity without the confusion. People forget that clarity is not a gift. It's earned through reflection. And reflection only happens when the noise quiets. So when you start perceiving your past not as a wound, but as preparation, that's a sign that the spiritual timing has shifted. That's God showing you that the emotional architecture of the relationship has been rebuilt from the inside out. You're no longer reacting from old fear. You're responding from understanding. You're no longer questioning whether you're worthy of the connection. You're beginning to recognize that you've grown into someone who can sustain it. This is where the psychological and the spiritual begin to overlap in a meaningful way. Because once your narrative about the past changes, your internal posture toward the future changes as well. You stop doubting whether this connection has purpose. You stop replaying worst case scenarios. The anxiety dissolves. In its place emerges a kind of grounded anticipation, not obsession, not desperation, but steady expectation. You feel ready, not restless. And readiness is a magnet. When two people reach that same emotional posture, when each has moved through resentment into understanding, through confusion into clarity, through fear into maturity, they naturally gravitate back toward one another. Not because they're trying to recapture what was, but because they finally become the version of themselves capable of building what could be. That shift, seeing your past through the lens of purpose rather than pain, is one of the clearest signs that your wait is almost over, because it means you've outgrown the very mindset that created the separation in the first place. So let your past teach you, not trap you. Let it refine you, not define you. Let it open you, not harden you. Because when you can finally see your history as preparation, you become ready for the future that's been waiting for you. Another sign that the wait is almost over is the subtle but unmistakable shift in the way you and this person begin moving toward each other. Again, not necessarily in dramatic gestures, but in small, consistent signals that reveal emotional alignment. Human behavior rarely lies. Even when people try to suppress how they feel, their actions reveal the truth. They become more attentive, more thoughtful, more present, even if they don't fully articulate their intentions. And those small shifts matter. They're indicators that something internal is reorganizing itself. You might notice they're no longer avoiding the conversations that once scared them. They're not running from vulnerability the way they used to. They're not shutting down or projecting their fears as aggressively. Instead, they're showing signs of reflection, signs that they've been thinking, reevaluating, reconsidering. You can sense that they've been replaying the story, not from a place of blame, but from a place of understanding. When someone begins doing the internal work necessary for reconnection, it often shows up as humility, curiosity, and a willingness to repair rather than defend. And the reason this is so important is because relationships don't heal through words alone. They heal through psychological readiness. Two people can want each other deeply, but if even one of them is emotionally unprepared, the relationship collapses under the weight of its own intensity. That's why growth on both sides is essential. That's why separation is sometimes God's way of ensuring that the timing doesn't destroy what could have been extraordinary. So when this person begins acting in ways that suggest they're no longer controlled by fear or pride, it's a strong indicator that something has transformed beneath the surface. It might be an unexpected message, a conversation that feels more genuine, a recognition of their own flaws, an apology spoken or implied. Even subtle shifts matter because they show that emotional walls are lowering, not being reinforced. At the same time, you might notice a parallel shift within yourself. You're not reacting impulsively. You're not craving validation the way you once did. You're not interpreting every silence as rejection. You're observing more, understanding more, grounding yourself more. This is the psychological maturity needed to sustain a healthy partnership. And it doesn't appear randomly. It emerges through introspection, growth, and time. What's striking about this stage is the synchronicity. Your emotional evolution begins to mirror theirs. You stop pushing and they start initiating. You stop doubting and they start clarifying. You stop chasing and they start approaching. It's almost as if something unseen is coordinating both sides, nudging each of you toward a new chapter that doesn't repeat the failures of the last one. That's the spiritual aspect of timing, not just when, but who you become when the moment arrives. This is why it's so important to pay attention to patterns, not fantasies. A person who is genuinely preparing to re-enter your life on a meaningful level becomes more responsible with their communication, more intentional with their presence, and more honest about their feelings. And these are not random behaviors. They're indicators of emotional congruence. They are the signs that the internal barriers that once made connection impossible have begun to dissolve. And when two people grow at the same time, even if they grow separately, the path between them becomes clearer. The tension eases. The misunderstandings soften. The fear quiets. What remains is a sense of readiness, a sense that what once felt impossible now feels natural, almost inevitable. So when you begin noticing these small but powerful shifts, understand that they aren't coincidences. They're signals that the